Go.
Okay, so we're going to take a look at the scoring rubric for question 3, literary argument. Today, we're going to start with row A, which is your thesis. As a reminder, you get up to 6 points for your essays. Previously, it used to be 9, but now it's 6. And it's built into 3 different categories. Our first is your thesis. You can get 0 to 1 point for your thesis. Over here, it talks about what gets 0 points versus what gets 1 point. Okay, we're going to start off with what gets 1 point because we like to look at the positive. So, a 1 point would be a thesis that responds to the prompt with a defensible thesis. Sorry, it's a little blurry. A defensible thesis that presents an interpretation and may establish a line of reasoning. Underline these words. Defensible thesis that presents an interpretation and may establish a line of reasoning. Okay, so what do these mean? Something that's defensible means that you can argue it. It means that you can get evidence and use that evidence to prove why you're right. When we talk about interpretation, this is your read, what you think the meaning is, right? What you think that meaning of the work as a whole is. Now remember, like I told you, there's not necessarily one right read or one right meaning. That's why it's your interpretation. Remember, we bring all our own individual knowledge into what we read, and so each person's interpretation may be slightly different. Of course, you can be completely off, like, totally off topic, but there's not one right answer. If that makes sense. Now, it may establish a line of reasoning. This is where you're giving some kind of roadmap. Okay, when I say roadmap, in order to figure out where you're going, you have a map, right? You can do the same thing in your thesis, where giving your line of reasoning is you telling your audience, which is the reader, where you are going with your argument, what you are going to prove. Now notice, it says may. So do you have to give a roadmap? No, but it is helpful to the reader. And one of the things to remember is that your reader should not have questions as they're reading your essay. It should be clear, it should be to the point, you should be, as Ms. Prudence says, cutting the clutter, and answering your prompt. Okay? So, some responses that earn this point, take a position, it takes a position on or provides a defensible interpretation and may establish a line of reasoning. So, that's basically just rephrasing what this says. Okay? So, you would get a 0 for your thesis if you don't have one. If your thesis only restates the prompt, which happens a lot. If the intended thesis provides a summary of the issue with no apparent or coherent thesis. So if you just say what the problem is without having what you're arguing, there is a thesis but it does not respond to the prompt, so you're not on topic. And then restates the prompt. Now, how many of you have done theses by restating the prompt and putting your own spin on it? That is appropriate. So I don't want you to get scared by this by being like, oh, I can't restate the prompt. You may use the language of the prompt to create your argument. So I'm going to write this down here. Use the language of the prompt to create your argument. And you'll see that sometimes that there is a difference between restating the prompt and using the language of the prompt to create your argument. Because sometimes people will just like restate the prompt and it'll be like, okay, and, or as Ms. Heaney may have written on your essays. So? So what? I just write so. You get it by now. I don't have to write the what. So, and, or like ... question mark. All right. Additional notes. The thesis may appear anywhere within the essay. This is different from before. Okay. I want to caution you. If your thesis is anywhere in your essay, your reader might get bored before they get to your thesis. Okay? So you can still get a point for your thesis if it's at the end. But when your reader is looking at your essay, I guarantee within the first 30 seconds, so within your intro, they see if you're on the right track or not. If you don't have a thesis, they'll automatically have an idea of where you're scoring. It's harder to prove you're good later than to start off strong and like finish up regular. Does that make sense? So we want to try and put that in our intro all the time. And then a thesis meets the criteria, can be awarded the point whether or not the rest of the response successfully supports that line of reasoning. This is good because this means if you have an intro plus a good thesis, you get a minimum score of 1 out of 6. Now, do we want 1 out of 6? No. 6 out of 6. Right? But at least you know, for those of you who run out of time sometimes with your essays, I find that a lot of times people like end up really focusing on 2 essays and then maybe the third one is like, bleh, like a paragraph. You can still at least get some points. Got it? All right. So questions about getting points for your thesis, this first section. Okay, let's move to the second page. Okay, so there's a whole lot on this one. This is where the bulk of your points come from. Remember, 0 to 4 points. That's 4 points. That's more than half of your essay comes from this. And that is evidence and commentary. Evidence, quotes and paraphrasing. Since this is a Q3, you are not going to have a lot of quotes. Okay? But you want to have paraphrase and not summary. Can anybody tell me the difference between paraphrase and summary? Yes?
Paraphrasing is where you finish the point, and then summarizing is where you basically restate the whole story.
The whole story? Yeah. So when we look at paraphrasing and summaries, summaries do sum up what the whole story is, right? So a summary sums it up, right? When you are paraphrasing, though, that's when you're putting the details into your own words. And it's looking at smaller pieces, not necessarily the whole thing. So that's why we want paraphrase in our Q3s. You're going to say, for example, when Holden is at the carousel, rain starts to fall and Holden starts to cry. Blah, 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 right? I'm giving smaller details about that specific section, but I'm putting it in my own words because for your Q3s, you don't have the book in front of you, okay? commentary, this is your analysis. That's where you are saying how your paraphrasing proves your thesis. So look at the for, because again, we always want to aim for a top. A for makes textual references, direct quotes, or paraphrase that are relevant to the thesis. So obviously this and provides well-developed commentary that consistently and explicitly explains the relationship between the evidence and the thesis. So again, you're going back to your thesis with every piece of analysis and commentary you have. You're not just telling me what happened, you're telling me why what happened is important to your argument. Everything's an argument. You're just using literature to make it. And the response must address an interpretation about the work as a whole. So this is where you should be talking about that theme or interpretation of the work as a whole. Sometimes you'll see it as meaning of the work as a whole. Sorry. You'll notice going down in points, you're getting less and less and less. So for a 3, you are making textual references and you're saying how it relates to your thesis, but it's uneven, limited, or incomplete. And you're also not really talking about that interpretation of a work as a whole, that theme. Here, for a 2, you are making textual references and having some commentary, but it is oversimplified, but it also could have misinterpreted, where you misunderstand things. 1 point, and again notice, and, but here, what do you have? Or, right? Summaries, non-specific references, references to text that are vaguely relevant. So your textual evidence here is not detailed. Or not relevant. And again, that goes back to the cut the clutter, because you don't want to be making arguments and using examples that don't go to prove your point. Like if you're making an argument, you have your exact examples that really prove your point. You don't want to bring up something that's like out of left field or that doesn't prove your point. Why are you wasting your time? You have 120 minutes to write 3 essays. Don't waste your time writing about details that don't matter. And it provides little or no commentary. And then a 0 only restates the thesis, repeats provided information, like rewrites what's already in the prompt, or provides examples that are generally irrelevant and are incoherent, like they don't make any sense. Like none of it makes sense. Why? Okay. Additional notes. Writing that suffers from grammatical and or mechanical errors. This is where you're looking at your syntax and grammar that interfere with communication cannot earn the 4th point. So you might have a lot of really, really good evidence and a lot of good commentary, a lot of good analysis, but if they can't understand it, because one page isn't one entire because a sentence takes up like the whole page, it's one giant run-on, then they'll knock you down. Okay? And the response responses must address the work as a whole to achieve a level of 4 points. And again, we already talked about that here, or you want to talk about that. So if we got a 1 on thesis, and we get a 4 here on our evidence and commentary, how many points do we have left to get? 1 more point. You guys good? Can I erase this? Sophistication. Okay, and again, ladies and gentlemen, this is your style. Okay, to get your point, because again, we're going to talk about what our goal is. Your style, how you write, should demonstrate sophistication of thought and or develop a complex literary argument. Okay, so how do we do that? Responses that earn this point may demonstrate sophistication of thought or develop a complex literary argument by doing any of the following. 1, crafting a thesis that demands nuanced consideration of textual evidence to prove, and then successfully proves it. Okay? 2, explaining the significance or relevance of an interpretation within a broader context. So this is where you're talking about your themes. 3, discussing alternative interpretations of a text. So you could supplement ideas. Like say, while other people may view Dimsdale as selfish, Dimsdale in fact is selfless because blah, 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 blah. Because you're talking about different interpretations there. Okay. Recognizing and accounting for contradictions and complexities within the text. So this is where you have a shout out to other reads. And saying that not all meanings are the same. Like we can have multiple meanings for a piece and recognizing that. 5, using relevant analogies to help an audience better understand an interpretation. An analogy is a comparison. Right? So you compare the work. To other things. Maybe use metaphors and other figurative language in your own writing. And 6, utilizing a prose style that is especially vivid, persuasive, convincing, or appropriate to the student's argument. And so when we talk about creating persuasive, convincing, and appropriate, we're talking about your diction, syntax, and I would say the general organization or of your logos, like your reasoning organization. Additional notes. This point should be awarded only if the demonstration of sophistication or complex understanding is part of the argument, not merely a phrase or reference. So, if you throw in one of these guys, it needs to be incorporated in your argument well, not just an afterthought. This one's harder to do. Remember your samples for Lang? Those 8s and 9s, where you were like, whoa. That's basically what this is. Actually, I would say like 7 up. 7 up in your 9-point rubric of adjustments. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Is this rubric just for the question 3 or
This is just for question 3. Question 1 and 2 also have specific rubrics because question 1 is poetry and question 2 is prose. And so they'll talk, they will speak in more detail about like the intricacies that come with those forms. Other questions?